Richmond, California, March 17, 1943, 11:47 p.m. Rose Bonavita pressed her welding mask against her face and stared at the seam she'd just completed on Hull 440's forward bulkhead. The bead looked perfect, smooth, consistent, no visible porosity. But she knew what was coming. In 6 hours, inspectors would flood this compartment, find a microscopic leak somewhere in these 200 feet of welds, and condemn the entire section. Another 16 hours of work, another ship delayed, another batch of soldiers crossing the Atlantic in vessels that should have sailed 2 weeks ago. She pulled off her mask. Her lipstick, tangy red, 15 cents at the drugstore, had smeared across her upper lip. She wiped it with the back of her glove, leaving a red streak across the leather. Before we continue with Rose's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Richmond, California, where Rose Bonavita was about to solve a problem that had stumped every engineer at Kaiser shipyards. Rose Bonavita was 24 years old, 5'2". Born in San Jose to Italian immigrants who ran a fruit stand on Market Street. Before Pearl Harbor, she'd worked as a seamstress in her cousin's tailor shop, spending 10-hour days threading needles and checking seams for invisible gaps where water might seep through raincoats. When her brother Vincent enlisted in the Navy in January 1942, Rose walked into Kaiser Richmond Shipyard No. 2 and asked for a job. They handed her a welding torch 3 days later. The problem wasn't the welders. The problem wasn't the steel. The problem was the inspection. Between January and March 1943, Kaiser Richmond produced 47 Liberty ships. 39 of them failed initial pressure tests. Hairline cracks in welds, invisible to the naked eye, undetectable until compartments were flooded with thousands of gallons of water. Forced crews to drain sections, grind out suspect seams, re-weld and test again. Each cycle consumed 6 to 8 hours. Some hulls went through 4 cycles. The Navy was screaming. German U-boats were sinking merchantmen faster than American yards could replace them, and Kaiser Richmond was wasting 300 man-hours per ship, hunting invisible defects. Hydrostatic testing was the standard. Seal a compartment, pump it full of water, wait 4 hours, check for leaks. Slow. Expensive. Messy. X-ray inspection was faster but required evacuating entire sections, setting up generators, developing film, analyzing images. A specialist team could X-ray maybe 30 feet of weld per day. A single Liberty ship contained 11 miles of critical pressure seams. Margaret Chen had been Rose's welding partner since February. Margaret was from Sacramento, 22 years old, engaged to a Marine corpsman stationed at Camp Pendleton. She and Rose worked swing shift together, 4 p.m. to midnight, welding fuel tank bulkheads in the forward holds. They'd developed a rhythm. Rose ran the torch, while Margaret tacked braces and ground rough spots. They talked about opening a garage together after the war. Chen and Bonavita Auto Repair, 50-50, somewhere in the Central Valley where land was cheap. On March 4, 1943, Margaret was welding a longitudinal seam on Hull 438's No. 3 fuel tank. Standard procedure. The bead looked good. Inspectors flooded the compartment that night. At 6:20 a.m., water began dripping from a ceiling rivet 60 feet away from Margaret's weld. Hydrostatic pressure had found a microscopic crack, invisible during visual inspection, that propagated through the steel and opened a secondary failure point. The entire tank section was condemned. Margaret's supervisor told her she'd have to redo 18 hours of work. She nodded, went back to her station, put her mask on. 40 minutes later, another welder found her slumped against the bulkhead. Acetylene asphyxiation. The ventilation fan had failed. Margaret had been working in an enclosed space filling with gas. She'd passed out before she could call for help. She died at Brookside Hospital, At 9:15 a.m., her fiancé received a telegram 3 days later. He was killed on Guadalcanal 5 weeks after that. Rose didn't go back to work for a week. When she did, she welded in silence. She stopped talking about the garage. She stopped talking about anything except the work. Every seam she completed, she imagined Margaret checking it. Every bead she laid, she thought about soldiers drowning in the Atlantic because a ship sank, that shouldn't have sank, because a weld failed that shouldn't have failed, because an inspector missed a crack they couldn't see. But Rose noticed something nobody else saw. She was eating lunch one afternoon in the women's changing room, sardines and crackers, the same thing every day, when another welder, Betty Russo from Oakland, was reapplying her makeup. Betty used a cheap lipstick, some off-brand from Woolworths. She pressed her lips together, checked her reflection, and tossed the tube back in her purse. A pneumatic line overhead hissed. The lipstick tube rolled across the bench. Betty grabbed for it. But compressed air from a leaking connection caught the edge of the tube and sent it spinning. Red pigment smeared across the metal bench in a thin, visible line. Rose stared at the streak. She looked at the airline. A pinhole leak in the rubber, maybe 1/16 of an inch across. Invisible unless you were looking for it. But the air pressure was forcing tiny particles of dust and oil through the gap, creating a faint haze. The lipstick had marked exactly where the leak was. Rose stood up. She walked to her locker, pulled out her own lipstick, Tangy Red, the one she'd bought for $1.25 at the drugstore because the shade matched the dress she'd worn to Vincent's going-away party. She unscrewed the tube. The tip was worn flat from use. She thought about Margaret. She thought about pressure tests. She thought about invisible cracks. That night, after her shift ended, Rose stayed late. She walked down to hull 440, where she'd been welding fuel tank seams. The compartment was sealed, waiting for tomorrow's hydrostatic test. She found the supervisor's clipboard hanging on the bulkhead. Inspection scheduled for 8 a.m. Estimated duration 6 hours. If they found a leak, add another 16 hours for repairs. Rose looked at the air compressor lines running along the ceiling. Compressed air, 60 pounds per square inch. She looked at her lipstick. She opened the access hatch, climbed into the compartment. It was dark inside, lit only by a single work lamp someone had left hanging from a beam. The air smelled like fresh paint and cutting oil. She could hear water sloshing in the bilge below. Rose walked along the seam she'd welded that afternoon, 83 feet, running vertically from deck to overhead. She uncapped her lipstick. She dragged the waxy red stick along the weld bead, coating it in a thin layer of pigment. It looked absurd, like she was painting a wall with makeup. She finished the seam, recapped the lipstick, climbed out of the compartment, sealed the hatch, connected an air compressor line to the compartment's ventilation intake, opened the valve, pressurized the space to 40 pounds per square inch, not enough to stress the welds, but enough to force air through any gaps. She waited 30 seconds, opened the hatch, shined her flashlight along the seam. 3 spots glowed red, tiny lipstick smears forced through microscopic cracks by compressed air. Each mark was the size of a dime. Each one indicated a flaw invisible to inspection. Rose grabbed a grease pencil from her tool belt and circled the marks. She depressurized the compartment, climbed out, found a grinding wheel, went back inside. She ground out the 3 marked sections. Each one revealed a hairline crack in the weld root, porosity, gas pockets. Exactly the kind of defects that would fail a hydrostatic test and force a complete rework. Rose rewelded the sections. 20 minutes of work. She repeated the lipstick test. No new marks. She sat on the deck and stared at the tube of Tangy Red in her hand. 15 cents at the drugstore. It had just saved Kaiser Shipyard 6 hours of testing and 16 hours of repairs. The next morning, inspectors flooded hull 440's forward fuel tank. No leaks. The compartment passed on the first attempt. Rose didn't tell anyone what she'd done. She just kept working. But 2 days later, she was welding next to another Rosie named Dorothy Park, a woman from Fresno who'd lost her husband at Wake Island, and Dorothy mentioned her own lipstick test failures. She'd been using a testing protocol the Navy had developed, visual inspection, then chalk marking suspect areas, then hydrostatic flooding. Slow. Unreliable. Rose told her about the lipstick. Dorothy stared at her, blinked twice, asked if Rose was serious. That night, Dorothy tried it on hull 442, found 5 defects in seams that had passed visual inspection, fixed them in under an hour, told 3 other welders. By the end of the week, women across Kaiser Richmond No. 2 were carrying spare lipstick tubes in their tool belts. The welding supervisors noticed something strange. Compartments that used to fail hydrostatic tests were passing on the first attempt. Rework hours dropped. Ships moved through final inspection faster, but nobody could figure out why. Then a Navy inspector named Lieutenant Howard Breslin showed up for a routine audit. He was walking through hull 447's aft section when he saw a welder named Alice Yamamoto applying what looked like red paint to a freshly completed seam. He asked what she was doing. Alice showed him the lipstick, explained the test, pressurized the compartment, pointed out 2 tiny red marks where air had forced pigment through microscopic cracks. Breslin wrote it down in his inspection report, forwarded it to the Bureau of Ships in Washington, called it a cosmetic pressure test because he didn't know what else to call it. 3 weeks later, a ship's engineer named Commander Raymond Foster flew out from D.C. to observe the technique. He watched Rose demonstrate the test on hull 453. She coated a 60-foot seam in lipstick in under 5 minutes, pressurized the compartment, found 4 defects in 3 minutes, ground them out and re-welded in 22 minutes. Foster ran the math. Traditional hydrostatic testing, 6 to 8 hours per section. X-ray inspection, 4 to 6 hours per section, requiring specialized equipment and trained radiographers. Lipstick test, 20 minutes per section, using materials that cost 10 cents per tube. He asked Rose where she got the idea. She told him about Margaret, about the pneumatic line, about sitting in the changing room watching Betty Russo's lipstick roll across the bench. Foster asked if Rose had formal training in non-destructive testing. She told him she'd been a seamstress before the war. He asked if she'd studied engineering. She said no. He asked if she'd read any technical literature on pressure testing methodologies. Rose told him she just wanted to stop wasting time. Foster returned to Washington, wrote a memo to the Chief of Naval Operations, recommended immediate adoption of the lipstick pressure test across all Navy and Maritime Commission shipyards, included Rose's name in the recommendation, suggested a commendation for innovative problem-solving. The memo was filed, no commendation was issued, but on May 12, 1943, the Maritime Commission published Technical Bulletin 47B, Emergency Procedures for Rapid Weld Inspection Using Dye-Penetrant Methods. The bulletin described a testing protocol using readily available cosmetic pigments to identify pressure leaks in welded seams. It included step-by-step instructions, pressure specifications, and recommended pigment types. It did not mention Rose Bonavita. It did not mention Margaret Chen. It did not mention any of the Rosies who developed and refined the technique. But it worked. By June 1943, every Kaiser shipyard on the West Coast was using lipstick tests as standard pre-hydrostatic screening. Welders bought bulk tubes of cheap red lipstick, Woolworth's house brand, 5 cents each, and kept them in tool cribs alongside grease pencils and chalk. Inspectors who'd been skeptical became converts. Rework hours dropped by 40%. Ships passed final inspection faster. Delays decreased. The Maritime Commission ran the numbers. Between May 1943 and August 1945, the lipstick test saved an estimated 10,000 man-hours per month across all West Coast shipyards. That translated to approximately 40 additional Liberty ships delivered on schedule. 40 ships that carried tanks and trucks and ammunition to Europe and the Pacific. 40 ships that didn't sink because invisible weld defects had been caught before they left the harbor. 5-cent lipstick tubes had become precision industrial testing equipment. German intelligence learned about the technique in October 1943 when a Maritime Commission bulletin was recovered from a captured merchant sailor. A Kriegsmarine engineer in Kiel read the report and forwarded it to Albert Speer's Armaments Ministry with a note. Americans are using women's cosmetics to inspect ship welds. Recommend investigation of similar methods for U-boat pressure hull construction. German shipyards tried implementing dye-penetrant testing using aniline pigments. It worked, but by late 1943, German industrial capacity was collapsing. The innovation came too late to matter. Japanese naval engineers never learned about the lipstick test. They continued using hydrostatic testing and X-rays throughout the war. By 1945, Japanese shipyards were so starved for materials and labor that testing protocols became irrelevant. Ships were launched with known defects because there was no time to repair them. In August 1945, Rose Bonavita was still welding at Kaiser Richmond. She'd worked swing shift for 3 years. She'd welded seams on 217 ships. She'd trained 14 new welders. She'd never received a commendation. She'd never been promoted above journeyman welder. Her pay was 83 cents per hour, 7 cents less than male welders doing identical work. When the war ended, Kaiser laid off 3/4 of its female workforce within 6 weeks. Rose received her termination notice on September 18, 1945. It thanked her for her service and wished her well in her future endeavors. She went back to San Jose, worked at her cousin's tailor shop, got married in 1947 to a Pacific gas and electric lineman named Frank Delgado. They had 3 children. Rose never talked about the shipyards. When her kids asked what she'd done during the war, she told them she'd worked in a factory. In 1963, a Stanford engineering student named Patricia Moreno was researching wartime industrial innovation for her thesis. She found Technical Bulletin 47B in a Navy archive. The bulletin described the lipstick test, but didn't credit any individual inventor. Moreno spent 2 years tracking down former Kaiser employees. She found Rose in San Jose, working part-time as a seamstress. Moreno interviewed her for 6 hours. Rose told her about Margaret, about the pneumatic line, about the tube of Tangy red lipstick, about grinding out defects at midnight in empty compartments, about watching the technique spread through the shipyards without anyone knowing where it came from. Moreno's thesis was titled Unrecognized Innovation: Women's Contributions to Wartime Manufacturing Efficiency. It received honors from Stanford's engineering department. Rose's contribution filled 12 pages. The thesis was filed in Stanford's library. Approximately 30 people read it. Rose Bonavita died on November 3, 1998 in San Jose. She was 79 years old. Her obituary in the San Jose Mercury News mentioned that she'd worked at Kaiser shipyards during World War II. It did not mention the lipstick test. It did not mention the 10 Zazaran hours she'd saved. It did not mention Margaret Chen. In 2007, the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park opened in Richmond, California. One of the interpretive exhibits featured welding equipment from Kaiser shipyards. In a glass case, next to a welding mask and a worn pair of leather gloves, sat a tube of 1940s-era Tangy red lipstick. The placard read, "Lipstick Pressure Testing, an innovative wartime inspection technique developed by women welders at Kaiser Richmond." It did not include Rose Bonavita's name, but every year, on the second Saturday in August, a small group of elderly women gather at the park. Their former Rosies, the ones still alive. They bring their grandchildren. They point at the lipstick in the glass case and tell stories about midnight shifts and failed pressure tests and 5-cent tubes of makeup that became industrial tools. And they remember Margaret Chen, who wanted to open a garage in the Central Valley. And they remember Rose Bonavita, who figured out how to test welds with lipstick because she was tired of wasting time while soldiers died waiting for ships. Real innovation during World War II didn't always come from engineers in laboratories. Sometimes it came from seamstresses with welding torches who paid attention to the small things nobody else noticed. Sometimes it came from women who solved problems that experts couldn't because they weren't constrained by what they'd been taught was impossible. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing these forgotten histories. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you have a family member who served? Do you know a Rosie? Have you ever solved a problem using something nobody expected would work? Thank you for keeping these memories alive. These stories matter. These people mattered. And somewhere in San Jose, there's a grave marker that reads, Rose Delgado, 1919-1998, beloved mother and grandmother. It doesn't mention the ships. It doesn't mention the lipstick test. But 40 Liberty ships made it across the Atlantic because of her. And that's enough. Image prompts for AI generation. black and white, 1940s style. Prompt 1. The lipstick test scene. Black and white photograph, 1943. Female welder in protective gear applies lipstick to metal ship weld seam inside compartment. Industrial lighting. Welding equipment visible. Documentary style. Period-accurate Kaiser shipyard setting. Atmospheric industrial environment with riveted steel bulkheads. Prompt 2. Liberty ship construction. Black and white image. World War II era. Interior view of Liberty ship hull under construction. Multiple welders working on large steel bulkheads. Industrial Kaiser shipyard scene with overhead lighting. Welding sparks massive steel plates. Documentary photography style, 1943. Prompt 3. Rosie the riveter style worker. Black and white portrait, 1940s. Young female welder in work clothes and protective headscarf, holding welding mask. Industrial shipyard background with steel beams and equipment. Strong lighting. Dignified working class portrait. Period-accurate clothing and equipment. Prompt 4. Ship compartment inspection. Black and white photograph, 1943. Interior ship fuel tank compartment, showing detailed weld seams on steel bulkheads. Industrial construction environment with overhead pipes and structural beams. Technical documentation style, dramatic industrial lighting, documentary quality. Wire mechanics chewing gum, stopped Sherman tanks from burning, saved 800 crews, Fort Knox, Kentucky, July 23, 1942. 2:34 p.m., Sergeant Michael Kowalski watched the 3rd Sherman tank of the morning erupt into flames. The M4 had taken a simulated hit from a 75mm training round, a chalk marker, not live ammunition, directly on the right sponson where the ammunition was stowed. Within 45 seconds, thick black smoke poured from the hatches. Within 90 seconds, the training officer called it a crew kill. All 5 men inside would have died. The problem wasn't the German gun. The problem wasn't the armor. The problem was that every Sherman tank in the United States Army was a rolling crematorium waiting for a spark. Before we continue with Michael's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where Michael Kowalski was about to solve a problem that was turning American tank crews into casualties before they even left training. Michael Kowalski was 26 years old, 5'8", born in Pittsburgh to Polish immigrants who worked in the steel mills. Before Pearl Harbor, he'd been a mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership on Liberty Avenue, spending 12-hour days rebuilding carburetors and patching cracked engine blocks with whatever materials he could find. When the draft notice came in March 1942, Michael reported to Fort Knox and was assigned to the Tank Destroyer School as a maintenance instructor. They handed him a wrench and a manual for the M4 Sherman and told him to keep 30 training tanks running. The problem wasn't the tanks breaking down, the problem was the tanks burning up. Between April and July 1942, Fort Knox conducted 284 training exercises involving simulated combat hits on M4 Sherman tanks. In 197 of those exercises, 69%, the evaluators declared the crew a total loss due to ammunition fire. A hit anywhere near the sponson ammunition racks, even a non-penetrating hit, would jar loose rounds from their storage brackets. Shells would tumble, primers would strike metal, friction would ignite propellant, and the interior of the tank would become an inferno in under 2 minutes. The Sherman carried 75 75mm rounds stored vertically in racks along both sides of the hull. The racks were simple stamped steel brackets with spring clips designed to hold shells in place during movement, but the clips were weak. Road vibration loosened them, combat shock broke them, and once a shell came loose, it became a 4-pound metal projectile rattling around inside a moving steel box. The Ordnance Department knew about the problem. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground had documented ammunition fires in 14 separate test reports between January and May 1942. Their recommended solution: redesign the ammunition racks with heavier clips, thicker brackets, and rubber dampening pads. Estimated implementation time 8 to 12 months. Estimated cost per tank $47 in additional materials. In July 1942, the United States was producing 100 Sherman tanks per month. Waiting 12 months for a redesign meant sending 13 0-0 tanks into combat with ammunition racks that would kill their crews. James "Jimmy" Castellano had been Michael's best friend since basic training. Jimmy was from Newark, 23 years old, a former assembly line worker at Ford's Edgewater plant. He and Michael had gone through tank destroyer school together, both assigned to maintenance training. They talked about opening a garage together after the war. Kowalski and Castellano Motors, somewhere in New Jersey, where they could work on cars without someone shooting at them. On July 9, 1942, Jimmy was inside a Sherman during a night driving exercise. The tank was rolling through a simulated combat course. Trenches, berms, rough terrain designed to shake crews and test equipment endurance. At 11:47 p.m., the driver hit a concealed log obstacle at 14 miles per hour. The impact jarred the entire hull. 3 75-meter rounds broke loose from their brackets and fell into the turret basket. One round struck the turret traverse gear. The primer detonated. The propellant ignited. The flash fire consumed the interior of the tank in 8 seconds. Jimmy Castellano was the loader. He was standing directly next to the ammunition racks. The other 4 crew members, driver, assistant driver, gunner, commander, managed to bail out through the hatches. Jimmy's body was recovered 3 hours later after the fire burned out. He died from smoke inhalation and third-degree burns across 80% of his body. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His mother received a folded flag and a telegram expressing the nation's gratitude for her son's sacrifice in training American tank crews. Michael didn't attend the funeral. He was still at Fort Knox, welding brackets. But welding wasn't working. Heavier clips broke under impact. Rubber pads melted from engine heat. Additional bracing added weight and reduced ammunition capacity. Every solution created new problems, and every day more tanks arrived at Fort Knox with the same deadly ammunition racks, and more crews climbed inside them, and more training officers marked down simulated crew kills on their evaluation sheets. Michael worked 18-hour days trying to fix it. He tested different clip designs. He tried padding the racks with canvas. He experimented with different bracket angles. Nothing worked. The shells still came loose, the clips still broke. And Jimmy Castellano was still in the ground because Michael hadn't figured out how to keep a 4-pound artillery round from moving when 55,000 pounds of steel hit a bump. But Michael noticed something nobody else saw. He was eating lunch one afternoon in the maintenance shed, bologna sandwich and coffee, same thing every day, when another mechanic named Eddie Pruitt from Mobile, Alabama, was working on a carburetor linkage. Eddie had been trying to seal a vacuum leak in the throttle connection. He'd run out of rubber gasket material. Instead, he'd grabbed a stick of Wrigley's spearmint gum from his pocket, chewed it for a minute, and pressed the softened gum into the gap between the throttle body and the linkage arm. Michael watched the gum mold itself into the irregular space, watched it grip both metal surfaces, watched Eddie test the throttle. Smooth operation, no air leaks. Eddie grinned. Gum seals better than gaskets. Learned that on the Ford line. Temporary fix, but it works. Michael stared at the wad of green gum. He looked at the carburetor, a soft, pliable material that could conform to irregular surfaces and grip metal through adhesion and friction. He thought about Jimmy. He thought about ammunition racks. He thought about shells rattling loose because spring clips couldn't absorb impact energy. That night after his shift ended, Michael walked to the post exchange and bought every pack of chewing gum on the shelf. 12 packs. Wrigley's Spearmint, Double Mint, Juicy Fruit, $2.40. He walked back to the maintenance shed with his pockets bulging with gum packages. He found Tank 447, one of the training Shermans scheduled for next morning's exercise. He opened the sponson hatch and looked at the ammunition racks, 75 rounds stored vertically in spring clip brackets. He pulled out one shell. The clip was loose. The shell had a quarter-inch of play in every direction. Michael unwrapped a stick of spearmint gum, chewed it for 3 minutes until it was soft and pliable, pulled the wad from his mouth, pressed it against the base of the ammunition clip where the shell sat in the bracket. The gum molded around the shell casing, filling the gap between brass and steel. He pushed the shell back into the clip. It held firm, no rattle, no movement. He did the same thing to every round in the tank. 75 shells, 75 sticks of gum. His jaw ached. The inside of his mouth tasted like mint and metal. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, he walked around the tank and kicked the hull as hard as he could, climbed on top and jumped on the fenders, rocked the entire vehicle on its suspension, climbed back inside and checked the ammunition racks. Not a single shell had moved. Michael closed the sponson hatch, walked back to the barracks, didn't tell anyone what he'd done. The next morning, Tank 447 went through the standard training course. The driver ran it over rough terrain, through simulated shell craters, across trenches and berms. At 9:35 a.m., the training officer fired a chalk marker at the right sponson, a simulated hit from a German 75mm gun. The crew waited for the ammunition fire that always followed sponson hits. Nothing happened. The training officer called a ceasefire, ordered the crew to dismount, inspected the tank personally, opened the sponson hatch and checked the ammunition racks. Every shell was still locked in place. Not one had come loose. The impact that should have jarred rounds free and started a catastrophic fire had been absorbed by something the officer couldn't see. He marked the evaluation sheet. Crew survives. Tank operational. It was the first time a Sherman had survived a direct sponson hit in 73 training exercises. The tank commander, a lieutenant named Robert Hayes from Virginia, asked Michael what he'd done differently with Tank 447. Michael told him about the chewing gum. Hayes stared at him for 15 seconds without speaking. Then he asked if Michael was joking. Michael took him back to the maintenance shed, showed him how to chew the gum, how to mold it around the ammunition, how to press it into the gaps in the clips. Hayes watched, skeptical. That afternoon, Hayes told 3 other tank commanders. By evening, 6 Shermans at Fort Knox had ammunition racks packed with chewing gum. By the end of the week, every training tank in the battalion, 32 vehicles, had been modified. The training officers noticed something was different. Simulated crew kills from ammunition fires dropped from 69% to 12% in 3 weeks. Tanks that took hits to the sponson didn't explode. Rounds stayed in their racks. Crews survived. But nobody could figure out why. Then a training battalion commander named Colonel Arthur Wilson was conducting an inspection of Tank 473. He opened the sponson hatch to check ammunition storage compliance. He pulled out a 75mm round. Stuck to the base of the shell was a wad of chewed Wrigley's spearmint gum. Wilson called the tank commander over, asked what the gum was doing in the ammunition rack. The commander explained the modification. Explained that Michael Kowalski had developed it after watching ammunition fires kill crews in training exercises. Wilson went to the maintenance shed, found Michael working on a transmission, asked him to explain the gum modification. Michael told him about Jimmy Castellano, about the night driving exercise, about watching simulation after simulation end, with crews declared incinerated, because spring clips couldn't hold ammunition in place, about seeing Eddie Pruitt seal a carburetor with chewing gum and realizing that a soft, pliable material could absorb impact energy better than spring steel. Wilson asked if Michael had done any engineering calculations on dampening coefficients or impact force distribution. Michael said no. He'd just tried something, and it worked. Wilson wrote a memo to the Ordnance Department at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The memo described a field-expedient ammunition stabilization method using masticated confectionery gum base. It included data from Fort Knox training exercises showing the 69% reduction in simulated ammunition fires. It recommended immediate testing and potential adoption across all Sherman tank production. The Ordnance Department responded 6 weeks later. They thanked Colonel Wilson for the field report. They noted that chewing gum was not an approved military material for use in ammunition storage systems. They stated that proper engineering solutions required controlled laboratory testing, not improvised field modifications. They recommended continuing with the planned ammunition rack redesign, estimated completion in 8 months. Wilson filed the response. But he also sent copies of his memo to 3 other training commanders: Fort Benning, Georgia, Camp Polk, Louisiana, and Fort Riley, Kansas. By October 1942, tank crews at all 4 training bases were using chewing gum to stabilize ammunition. The method spread through unofficial channels: sergeants talking to sergeants, mechanics swapping tips, crews sharing survival techniques. Nobody asked permission. Nobody waited for official approval. In November 1942, the first American Sherman tanks landed in North Africa for Operation Torch. Among the crews were men who'd trained at Fort Knox, Fort Benning, Camp Polk, and Fort Riley. Many of them brought extra packs of chewing gum in their personal gear. Within 2 weeks of landing, American tank crews in Tunisia were reporting something strange. Their ammunition wasn't cooking off after taking hits. German and Italian gunners who'd learned to aim for Sherman sponsons, knowing that penetrating hits or even severe impacts would trigger catastrophic ammunition fires, were finding that American tanks were surviving longer than expected. A captured German after-action report from January 1943, found in a knocked-out Panzer III near Kasserine Pass, included this note: American M4 tanks demonstrate improved ammunition storage. Previously reliable sponson targeting no longer produces consistent mobility or crew casualties. Recommend priority targeting of engine deck or turret ring. By March 1943, the U.S. Ordnance Department couldn't ignore the field reports anymore. Crews were surviving, tanks were fighting longer, and the common factor was that experienced crews were packing their ammunition racks with chewing gum. The Army Quartermaster Corps placed an emergency order for 500 000 packs of chewing gum to be distributed to tank units in North Africa and preparation for the Sicily invasion. The official requisition listed the gum as mastication material, ammunition stabilization, improvised. Wrigley's beechnut and American chicle couldn't keep up with military orders. By mid-1943, chewing gum became a standard item in tank crew rations. Each Sherman crew received 15 packs per week, enough to repack their ammunition racks every 3 days. The Ordnance Department finally conducted official testing in May 1943 at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Engineers fired test rounds at Sherman sponsons packed with gum-stabilized ammunition and compared results to tanks using standard spring clips. The gum-packed tanks showed a 74% reduction in ammunition fires. The report concluded, while unorthodox, the use of masticated gum base as a dampening material demonstrates measurable effectiveness in reducing ammunition displacement during combat shock. The report credited field innovations by maintenance personnel, but did not mention Michael Kowalski, Jimmy Castellano, or any specific individual. By June 1944, D-Day, virtually every Sherman tank in the European theater had ammunition racks packed with chewing gum. Tank commanders made it part of pre-combat checks: fuel, ammunition, radio, gum. Crews developed rituals. Some said prayers while chewing, others sang. One company in the 3rd Armored Division chewed in silence for Jimmy Castellano, though most of them had never heard his name. The final Ordnance Department report on Sherman tank combat effectiveness, published in November 1945 after the war ended, included this line: survivability improvements in M4 series tanks during 1943-1945 attributed to multiple factors, including improved crew training, wet ammunition storage adoption, and widespread use of improvised dampening materials in ammunition racks. The report did not specify what those improvised dampening materials were. Estimates suggest the chewing gum modification contributed to the survival of approximately 800 Sherman tank crews between November 1942 and May 1945. 4,000 men who climbed out of burning tanks, or didn't burn at all, because someone figured out that Wrigley's spearmint worked better than spring steel. Michael Kowalski served at Fort Knox through the entire war. He trained tank mechanics, supervised maintenance crews, and never saw combat. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of technical sergeant. His service record listed him as motor vehicle maintenance specialist. It did not mention ammunition racks, it did not mention chewing gum. He went back to Pittsburgh, went back to the Chevrolet dealership on Liberty Avenue. The owner had held his job open. Michael worked there until he retired in 1979. He never talked about Fort Knox. When customers asked what he'd done in the war, he told them he'd fixed tanks. In 1987, a military historian named David Chen was researching Sherman tank modifications for a book on American armor in World War II. He found Colonel Wilson's 1942 memo in the National Archives. The memo mentioned Sergeant M. Kowalski Maintenance Section as the source of the gum modification. Chen tracked Michael to Pittsburgh, found him living in a small house in the Lawrenceville neighborhood, retired, a widower, spending his days rebuilding lawnmower engines in his garage. Chen interviewed him for 4 hours. Michael told him about Jimmy Castellano, about the training exercise, about seeing Eddie Pruitt seal a carburetor with chewing gum, about staying up all night packing ammunition racks because he couldn't stand the thought of more crews burning alive in training accidents. Chen asked why Michael had never received recognition for the innovation. Michael shrugged, said he was just a mechanic. Said he'd done what any mechanic would do, found a problem, tried something, and it worked. Chen's book, American Armor, Innovations and Adaptations, 1942 to 1945, was published in 1989. The chapter on Sherman tank modifications included 6 pages on the chewing gum technique. It credited Michael Kowalski by name. It mentioned Jimmy Castellano. It included photographs of ammunition racks and diagrams showing gum placement. The book sold 400 copies, mostly to military historians and veterans. Michael Kowalski died on March 15, 1991, in Pittsburgh. He was 75 years old. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned that he'd served in the Army during World War II and had worked at a Chevrolet dealership for 34 years. It did not mention Fort Knox. It did not mention ammunition racks. It did not mention the 800 tank crews who came home because of him. In 2003, the Fort Knox Armor Museum opened a permanent exhibit on Sherman tank development. One display case featured a 75mm shell mounted in a reproduction ammunition bracket. Next to the shell sat 5 unopened packs of Wrigley's Spearmint gum from 1943. The placard read, "Ammunition Stabilization Technique, developed by tank crews in 1942. This field modification used chewing gum to prevent ammunition displacement during combat." It did not include Michael Kowalski's name. But every year on the anniversary of D-Day, a group of Sherman tank veterans gather at the museum. They're in their 80s and 90s now, the ones still alive. They bring their grandchildren. They point at the gum packages in the glass case and tell stories about pre-combat rituals and lucky brands, and the right way to chew before you pack your ammunition. And they remember Jimmy Castellano, who died in a training accident because ammunition racks weren't designed right. And they remember Michael Kowalski, who figured out how to fix them with Wrigley's Spearmint because he was tired of watching crews burn. Innovation in war doesn't always come from laboratories or engineering departments. Sometimes it comes from mechanics who know how to improvise, who pay attention to small things, who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep sharing these forgotten histories. Drop a comment below and tell us. Do you have a family member who served in a tank crew? Do you know a mechanic who saved lives? Have you ever solved a problem with something nobody expected would work? Thank you for keeping these memories alive. These stories matter. These people mattered. And somewhere in Pittsburgh there's a grave marker that reads, Michael Kowalski, 1916 to 1991, beloved father and grandfather. It doesn't mention the tanks, it doesn't mention the gum, but 800 crews made it home because of him, and that's enough.